Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website, as well as those who will on a future occasion be joining us on the C-SPAN network. We remind all of our internet viewers that questions or comments can be emailed to us at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And following the program, we will, of course, post it on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference. Opening our discussion and introducing our special guest is David Kreutzer. Mr. Kreutzer is Senior Research Fellow in Energy Economics and Climate Change in our Center for Data Analysis. He researches how energy and climate change legislation will affect economic activity at the national, local, and industry levels. His research has appeared in numerous professional journals. He has also written for numerous mainstream newspaper and media outlets. Prior to joining us here at Heritage, Dr. Kreutzer was an economist at Behrman & Company. From 1984 to 2007, he taught economics at James Madison University. Please join me in welcoming David Kreutzer. David?
Well, I want to thank all of you for coming, and I want to thank all the people that are watching online and who will be watching on C-SPAN. Very happy today to have our lead-off speaker, Senator James Inhofe. Many of you know him, and most of what I tell you here will be stuff you already know, but for those who don't, Senator Inhofe is an Army veteran and is currently the chairman of the U.S. Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, and is senior member of the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee. He's an avid pilot with over 11,000 hours of flight hours. Senator Inhofe became the only member of Congress to fly an airplane around the world when he repeated Wiley Post's legendary trip around the globe. In addition, he tells me that when people ask him how old he is, he says he's old enough to fly a plane upside down. And when he can't do that anymore, then he'll think about maybe how old he is to be in the Senate. But we're glad he's there now and hope he stays a long time. The conservative publication Human Events, in editorializing on a recent top 10 most outstanding conservative senators, ranked Inhofe the #1, saying he is an unabashed conservative, and noted that he's unafraid to speak his mind. Those of us who have been following him will second that, and we're glad that he's unafraid to speak his mind. In 2013, the National Journal magazine ranked Inhofe among the top 5 most conservative members of the Senate. Senator Inhofe has been married to his wife Kay for 55 years, and they have 20 kids and grandkids. So don't tell him he doesn't care about the future. So would you please help me in welcoming Senator Inhofe to the podium?
Well, that would have been 20 years ago.
Oh, I was there 20 years ago.
Were you?
Oh,
We'll
yeah.
talk about
Okay,
that.
good. Okay.
We will. That's neat. You guys, I have a little voice problem today. And I have about a 5-minute voice, but I have a full 30 minutes here. So anyway, I just wanted to share with you. Yeah, that's right. She was there when I was in the House, and that was 20 years ago. And she was there, yeah. Yeah, she wasn't married at that time, so it was Molly Inhofe. You go back and look it up. Cute little girl. Yeah. Anyway, let me. I was talking to the Heartland Institute, and Jim DeMint was there, and he said, "Come here and tell us the same thing." So, Myron, you've already heard this, so you can leave if you want to. But you know, Myron and I were fighting this battle back before it was popular, and I always remember the time that we went to that first. You all are aware of these annual meetings that the UN has, where they bring everybody in, pay for everything, and you know the condition is they have to say they want to do something about global warming. And you remember the one in Italy, Milan, Italy. That's right, where they had the wanted posters up with my picture on them. And we went where they were making those things, and I asked what he's going to do with the leftovers. They was really flattered. I brought them back and used them for fundraisers, and it worked out real well. So anyway, that's we've been involved in this thing for a long time. Now, this is what I want everyone to have, because I put this together for people like you So when you go and you get in these discussions with people, you've got documentation. Conservatives have to be documented. I think you know that. So that is the reason for that. Now, confession is good for the soul. Let me just mention this. Back when I was first in the Senate, and when at that time everyone was talking about global warming and the world's coming to an end, so I assumed that it must be true. Until we found out that the cost of the thing, now that was actually MIT and the Charles Rivers Associates and all of them, the range has always been, and still is today, between $300 and $400 billion a year. And of course, then I started paying attention. I said, well, make sure the science is right. And that's when we found out it wasn't. It just took one speech on the Senate floor, and all of a sudden, the real scientists started coming out of the woodwork. And they came in and they would tell the truth about some of them had been on the IPCC and been kicked off because they didn't buy their thing. So anyway, that was a. And I want to mention what's going on today because Senator Whitehouse has now given his 100th floor speech. I think you know that. And if you listen to them, they're all exactly the same. And I happen to like that guy. I don't blame him for being the direct beneficiary of all this money that's being the Tom Steyer money and all that, because he wasn't even up for re-election at that time. But nonetheless, there's a reason for that first speech, which was April 18th, 2012. And that's because that was right after Tom Steyer made his announcement that he was going to put $100 million into campaigns in the 2014 campaign cycle. Well, he did that, and of course, at that time, the reason I think that he got involved is we're winning this thing. I mean, I'll show you in a minute the documentation for that, but nonetheless, anyway, it's all about money, and you might remember when the cover of the National Review, where Al Gore was there with all of his, he was speculated by the New York Times as being the first environmental billionaire, and I think probably he was. But anyway, one of the things, this Gore effect was kind of funny because every time he tried to have something would happen. There was his global warming cruise across the Northwest Passage to talk about global warming, but the passage was frozen. In February of 2007, he was at a House hearing on warming. That was canceled after the snowstorm when he was there. Pelosi in 2009 was snowed out of her global warming rally. So these things have actually happened, and I think that even though the activists and other climate change entrepreneurs like Steyer committed the money, they didn't do very well in the last election. Now, what is new about this is just 3 weeks ago, a new Tom Steyer arrived. His name is Jay Faison, Faison. He came up and he said, well, I'm a Republican. I can start working on the Republicans in the Senate. You work on the Democrats, I work on the Republicans. And so he put up $175 million of his own money. You may not have been aware of that, but I guess you were. But that was, when you add it together for the next, that's $250 million that's going to go into campaigns. So anyway, we have found out that he has a lot of interest in solar energy. Now, the next one, I like this one. Can you see that? All right, that was really neat. That was really snowy, and so one of the pages went out and made a snowball. It's the first time, I want you guys to know this, the first time in the history of the United States Senate that someone has thrown a snowball at the presiding officer. Now, I arranged to have a kid in there that was, he actually was a page from Oklahoma, and so I told him I was going to throw it low, and he intercepted. It was beautiful. I enjoyed it, no one else did. But anyway, the reason I bring that up is because on this handout, when you are challenged, and I went back and I looked up the things that they were saying 15 years ago, the arguments that they're using, they're still using today. And these arguments, I mean, you pick out any of them that you want here, and you need to have this with you because there are 4 things on here that will give you the wisdom and the documentation for the things that you say. For example, number 4 here is that polar bears are disappearing. Well, the fact is that there is a problem with the polar bear right now. It's called overpopulation. The 50s, there are between 5,000 and 10,000 polar bears. Today, there are between 15,000 and 25,000. So anyway, I won't go over all of these, but carry this with you. And when you hear someone on the Senate floor, you'll recognize right from this sheet what their arguments are going to be. If you'll just forgive me for that, I'll make something happen here. You have to go back also and look at the history of this thing, because it was way back in 1997 that we did the Hague-Byrd rule, and that said, if you come back from Rio de Janeiro, talking about Gore, and you have a treaty, and that treaty doesn't either harden our economy or it's not going to force China and the rest of the countries to do what we have to do, then we're not going to ratify it. That passed 95-0. Then along came John McCain. The McCain-Lieberman bill, that was 2002. He had this, it was a cap and trade bill, and that's where we used the $300 to $400 billion, and Myra, you remember that very well. And then we won that one. And then the same thing in 2005. Now, it's interesting. We won those elections, won those races, but no one would join me down on the floor. It was lonely down there at that time. And so since that time, we've had a lot of other ones. The House got involved. We have Markey and Waxman and all of that. So, and right now, I belong to the most exclusive club in Washington. It's called United States Senators Who Are Not Running for President. Well, this is, with the exception of Lindsey Graham, they're all on our side on this issue. Now, this whole thing should have been over with ClimateGate, and I'm going to go back and refresh your memory on that. These parties that they have, the UN puts up, are every December, and the one that was in Copenhagen, Obama went over, Nancy Pelosi, John Kerry, Barbara Boxer, and Hillary Clinton, all five of them went over to tell the 192 countries that we're going to pass legislation that was cap and trade legislation. Then I went over as one-man truth squad, and it was really fun. I remember talking in Wyrick's place right after getting back. It was really kind of neat, because I went over there and I said, now you've heard about all these people. I'm going to tell you guys, it's not going to happen. They all lied to you. And of course, it didn't happen. But all 191 other countries had one thing in common. They all hated me. But nonetheless, here's the interesting thing. Right before leaving, do you remember Lisa Jackson? Lisa Jackson was the first appointment of EPA director by this president. And I was the only Republican who liked her. And it's because she couldn't tell a lie. You don't fit in this administration unless you can lie. And so I asked her the question right before I went over to Copenhagen. I said, now, this is live on TV. I said, now, I have a feeling that once I leave town, you're going to come up with an endangerment finding to allow you to do with regulations what you can't do. You don't have the votes to get done legislatively. And she kind of smiled, so I knew it was true. And I said, when you do, you have to use some kind of a science behind it. What science are you going to use? And she said, the IPCC. Well, that's the United Nations. And so it couldn't have been more appropriate. It was a matter of hours after that ClimateGate came along. Now, on this handout you have, here we actually, on the handout, tell you the quotes that were made, like on the UK Telegraph said this, the worst scientific scandal of our generation. And it goes on and on. This is a good thing to carry with you, because that should have killed it right there. And we have the quotes from the people, Michael Mann and others, who were trying to rig this thing, and so that should have actually ended it at that point. But anyway, Lisa Jackson has always been really handy. That's why she's fired. But I remember one time I asked her the question. I said, now, you know, whether you do it through legislation or regulation, if you do this and you do a cap and trade, is that going to have the effect of reducing CO2 emissions worldwide? And she said, no, it wouldn't do that. And the reason is that this isn't where the problem is. And the problem is China. You got to do it in India. You got to do it in Mexico. And if you don't do that, you could have the reverse effect. If you chase away our manufacturing base here, where do they go? They go to places like China and like India. It could have the effect of increasing, not decreasing it. Well, that wasn't a very popular response to the question with the administration. So but this ClimateGate should have entered it right there at that time. So then along came Gina McCarthy. She was a little bit more compatible with the administration. And if you look at the Clean Power Plan, and I know you're going to be talking about that in a minute, the Clean Power Plan is actually worse than legislation, because legislation affects the emissions of individuals or companies that emit 12,000 tons of CO2. And if you do it by regulation, that would be under the Clean Air Act, it would be 250,000 tons. 250 tons, yeah. So it'd be much more expensive than the 300 to 400. Anyway, that's what is going on now. If you look at the next one, to give you an idea, and my state is somewhat of a leader, we now have 32 states opposing the Clean Power Plan. And we have 15 that have sued the EPA over it, and we're one of them, my state of Oklahoma. And we formally announced our intent just to say no and not do it. So we're really coming out ahead on this thing in terms of the public perception. And if you look also, you see now, and this is something that is happened only recently, even the New York Times came out and took a shot at them, saying they are using the EPA illegally, and they're talking about the cap and trade and the water plan. You know, that's another big one too. That's not the discussion of today, but the water of the United States, you might remember, they were trying to put that thing together to take the word navigable out. I agree that states should have all the jurisdiction over water in the United States, but I agree also the federal government, if it's navigable, should be involved in it. So they had the navigable element in there, and they tried to do it legislatively. And you might remember that Senator Feingold from Wisconsin and Congressman Oberstar from Minnesota were the House and the Senate sponsors of that. Not only did we beat the legislation, but we beat both of them in the next election. So we had the public on our side on this thing, and now we have the newspapers and others are coming out. And the crisis came, though, when they finally, in addition to ClimateGate, if you look at this chart here, it's kind of neat. The red line is what they were guessing. All of their models were predicting that this is what was going to happen with the temperatures, and then, of course, it didn't happen. So that was another little crisis that they even the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change admitted that a 2013 report that almost all historic simulations do not reproduce the observed recent warming. That is their fancy way of saying it's not warming. So we've now gone through 15 years where this didn't happen. You know, I remember early on, it's kind of fascinating. I don't know why I'm the only one who talks about this, but it is fascinating that if you go back to 1895, that was the first time they ever used another ice age. They used that term. And this goes in 30-year cycles. That lasted to 2018. Went from 1895 to 1918. And then in 1918, all of a sudden it started getting warm, and that's when they started using the global warming. Now that continued until 1945. In 1945, it started getting cooler again, and that lasted 30 years. Here's the interesting thing about that. 1945 is the date of the largest surge of CO2 emissions in the history of America. It's right after World War II. And that precipitated not a warming period, but a cold period. So this has been, you know, God's still up there. We still have these. And one of the things, they call this the hiatus now. The hiatus is not getting warmer any longer. It's leveled off now for the last 15 years, so we're going into another cycle. And it is another indicator that I use. Anytime there is a cause like this, a liberal cause, and that they are not getting the attention of the public, what do? They result in insults and and demands, and I have all of these down in that handout that you have so that you can have access to it. One of the John Kennedy Juniors, I guess it was, said called me a prostitute. Robert Kennedy said this is treason. We ought to start treating them as traitors. And the Echo magazine Grist called for Nuremberg-style trials for me. And Barron, calls for capital punishment. Well, this always comes out. You get the insults, you get and because they know that they don't have truth on their side. So the other thing that is on here that you'll be wanting to use is the fact I've repeated several times that they're trying to resurrect this issue. They're resurrecting it because people now know better. I remember when the Gallup polls always had global warming as either number one or number two as the greatest concern. This right here, the one that you are looking at, has it now very last. It's number 15 out of 15. So they've gone from number 1 to number 15. And they also say even among the environmental problems, this is Gallup poll just last March, it's dead last it's right behind the tropical rainforest. So we're actually are winning in that respect. And I might mention also, you talking about being at the university down there where Molly was, George Mason did a thing too. They interviewed all of the TV meteorologists, and they came to the conclusion, and they printed this out, that 63% think that if global warming is real, it's not man-made. That's 63% of the guys that are out there. So that is the recent thing that's happened. So what's the motive? And that's my UN thing. If you read my book, the last chapter is the longest chapter, and that goes back and gives you, in fact, I had a young man in my office, because he was enjoying this so much, do the research of the United Nations. And it goes back and actually talks to the 1970s on how they're trying to figure out a way. We have a group of senators. Every time the United Nations does something that's not in the best interest of us in the United States, we'll send a letter and we'll all sign it and say we're going to reduce our contribution to the United Nations. And they hate that. They don't want to be accountable to anyone. So how can they keep from being accountable? They develop their own source of funding, and that's what this is all about. And this is how they started. And you have the motives of this thing, I think, are pretty obvious. The first motive is to stop the accountability to the United States. That's obvious. The second one, and I have these quotes also in the paper that I hope you'll be carrying with you. If you look at Jacques Chirac, he said a long time ago, he said, he was the French president at that time, he said, Kyoto represents the first component of authentic global governance. Then you had the EU minister from Margot Wallström. She said Kyoto is about the economy, about leveling the playing field for big business worldwide. And so the last thing, the third thing in line would be power. And I think that Richard Lindzen has always been my favorite one to quote. I don't have the quote he said about Al Gore, but he talked about it's bad enough to lie, but to do it for your own financial benefit is worse. But the one I enjoy, he said, controlling carbon is a bureaucrat's dream. If you control carbon, you control life. And that's what this is all about. Now, obviously, this is not very popular to talk about when you're in the Senate, but we've been doing it now for 15 years, and nothing's happened so far except the public has caught on. So good things are happening, and I wanted to share that with you and give you some of these quotes that you can have to show very clearly that and all that's happening right now. It's we're still winning this thing. And the cost of the thing is just, I noticed you had, and I didn't know this until I walked in about a half an hour ago, that you had down there the social costs, and you'll have to explain that to them because I still haven't figured that out. So,
They're working on it themselves.
Yeah, to say that, because they can't refute the fact that the cost is between $300 and $400 billion a year. Now, it'd be for cap and trade. Now, what I do in Oklahoma, just because I take these positions, and I want to make sure people back there understand that it may not be popular, but it is when you explain it. I always take, every time I hear a big figure, I take the number of families in my state of Oklahoma who file a federal tax return, and I do the math. The amount of money that it would cost them would be about $3,000 a year per family. But again, even if you believe that stuff, this doesn't solve the problem. And I can tell you right now, the people in Oklahoma, they understand that. But I do believe that that is the thing that people, the other side doesn't want to talk about, is the cost. And that's how they invented social costs. If I had time, I would stay and hear you explain the social costs, because none of my staff has been able to do that to me. All right, with that, that's the time I had reserved here. But I'll be glad. There are, yeah, I do. Yeah, there are 2 minutes left in my segment here, so I'd be glad to respond to questions.
Please give your name and any association, and wait for the microphone because this is on TV and so on. Any questions? Okay, Mark?
Hi, Senator. I'm Mark Whittington. Used to work on the Senate staff on this issue.
Yes, sir.
And my question, I'm now retired. My question is, are you going to update your book?
You know, I've thought about that, and the only update would be what's happened since that time, and I think that people know that. But I really have. I've given a lot of thought to that, and in fact, the little girl that was teaching with you down at James Madison University, Molly, she wrote one of the chapters. Remember the igloo? Yeah, the igloo. Who had well, that was my daughter Molly and her family of 6 who built an igloo because they're snowed in here. It wasn't supposed to be snowed. They're snowed. All airlines were down, and it was a real igloo. I mean, it sleeps 4 people, and so she was declared by MSNBC to be the worst family in America. And so Molly did a chapter on how great her family is, and they're all achievers and all that. Anyway, questions? All right, you guys, get your panel together, and then we'll talk about whether or not you did that. I remember going down and seeing, now Molly, she's a beautiful little girl, but she's very small. And I walked in, and she didn't know I was coming. And there she was in this huge auditorium. I could barely see her down there. And that was my daughter.
I'm sure I know.
I'll bet you had.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very, very much. Okay. Well, while the panel comes up, I'll just give a little introduction as to what the social cost of carbon is, and I think building on what the senator said, if you look at it's Pat, Kevin, and Marlo, and I think Pat will tell us exactly how much moderation of warming we're likely to get from any of these policies, or even much more extreme policies. And that's a pretty depressing number if you're trying to push climate policy, to say that it really has so little impact. And instead, they've come up with a substitute, because if you say, well, 0.05 of a degree by 2050, that's not enough to really motivate people in the sort of end-of-the-world mentality. And so they have something called the social cost of carbon. The social cost of carbon purports to give a number that is equal to the damage done to the economy by a ton of CO2 emitted in any particular year, aggregating all the damage from that year until the year 2300, which is a long ways away in the event. So what I will do is I will give the introduction of the panelists all at once, and then I will have them come up and speak so we won't have a break in between, and then we'll do questions at the end. The first speaker is Patrick J. Michaels. He's the director of the Center for the Study of Science at the Cato Institute. He is past president of the American Association of State Climatologists and was program chair for the Committee on Applied Climatology of the American Meteorological Society. He was a research professor of environmental sciences at the University of Virginia for 30 years. He has written and been published in major scientific journals, including Climate Research, Climate Change, Geophysical Research Letters, Journal of Climate, Nature, and Science, as well as in popular serials worldwide. He's written or edited 6 books, and I'm sure he'd like you to buy multiple copies of all of them. I've read 3 of them. They're very, very good, entertaining, and insightful. He holds a bachelor and master's degree in biological sciences and plant ecology from the University of Chicago, and a PhD in ecological climatology from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. The second speaker is our own Kevin Dayaratna, who grew up in Princeton Junction, New Jersey. He did his undergraduate work at the University of California, Berkeley, and his major there was applied mathematics with a specialty in mathematical physics. He also holds 2 master's degrees from the University of Maryland, one in business and management, and the other, excuse me, one in business management, the other in mathematical statistics. He followed that up and finished his PhD there at the University of Maryland a year ago with specialties in Bayesian modeling and statistical computing. His doctoral dissertation was titled Contributions to Bayesian Statistical Modeling in Public Policy Research. So he's not just some egghead, he's our egghead. No, so he does science, he does business, and he has math with a focus on policy, which is not that common, and we feel lucky to have him here. The batting cleanup is Marlo Lewis. Marlo Lewis Jr., if you Google Marlo Lewis and try to find the books he's written, you will find his father's name pops up. His father was the producer and creator of The Ed Sullivan Show, and one of my favorites, Sergeant Bilko's The Phil Silvers Show. But in any event, that's not Marlo, that's his father, but he's also a bluegrass musician. He's at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. He's been published in the Washington Times, Investors Business Daily, Tech Central Station, the National Review, and Interpretation, a journal of political philosophy. Prior to joining CEI in 2002, he served as Director of External Relations at the Reason Foundation in Los Angeles. During the 106th Congress, Marlo served as Staff Director of the House Government Reform Subcommittee on National Economic Growth, Natural Resources, and Regulatory Affairs. He also served in other places on the Hill. He served in the State Department as a teenager, I think. It was in the Reagan administration. He holds a PhD in government from Harvard University and a BA in political science from Claremont McKenna. I want to thank all of the speakers, and we'll just have them come up, starting with Pat. Please take over.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to talk about climate change because I like talking about insanity. And I want to give you an example that is in this morning's paper. Our EPA issued a report yesterday in preparation for the Paris meeting, of course, that says that we're all going to die unless we agree to limit our emissions to values that we can't limit them at Paris. And the spin-off story was that global warming will increase severe weather in the United States. That means tornadoes, floods, hurricanes, et cetera, severe thunderstorms. Now, I have a question for you. In what state in this country has the largest exodus of individuals in the United States? California, by far. California's economy has got some problems, some of which probably have to do with their greenhouse gas rules. And what state has the largest inflow of people? Texas. That's right. So, California. The severe weather in California, there is none. If you want to talk about the drought in California, that is man-made by the people. The effects of it are man-made by the people in Sacramento. The California water system can hold 5 years' worth of water. And so there should not be a problem there, except they chose to make it a problem. Texas has the highest frequency of tornadoes in the country, severe thunderstorms. It's hotter than hell. Been to Houston. This is Houston on a good day. Extreme cold. Blue northers go down the panhandle of Texas to Brownsville. The sky turns bright blue and the temperature plummets. Hurricanes. Can anybody say the Galveston hurricane killed 7,000 people in 1900? Largest single weather-related disaster in the history of the United States. And floods. Tropical storm Claudette, which occurred when I was starting at University of Virginia, I believe holds the 24-hour rainfall record for the United States at Elvin, Texas. So people choose to go from an environment where there is no severe weather to one where severe weather is a daily occurrence. And yet the EPA says that this is going to cause all these problems. Well, it's very clear that people adapt to their environment, and as long as they have enough money to do so. Okay, with that diatribe, I'd like to, how do I push this thing forward here? Okay, interagency working groups determination of social cost of carbon. Is it scientifically justified? Huh, that's kind of an easy one to answer. Let's talk about global warming for just a second. You know, you're taught in school here in the Mid-Atlantic, it's not the heat, it's the humidity. Well, I'd like to rhyme that with what you should be thinking about global warming, which is not the heat, it's the sensitivity. Sensitivity is defined, one definition, as the amount of warming that you get for an arbitrary doubling of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere after all is said and done. If the sensitivity is low, we have a non-issue. If the sensitivity is high, or the probability that the sensitivity is high is not negligible, then people will invoke the precautionary principle and legislate to their heart's content. Now let me tell you about the Intergovernmental Working Group. That's the group that put together the social cost of carbon. This man here is Mr. Gorbachev, in case you can't tell. He's fond of saying, that's old thinking. Well, what the Interagency Working Group does, is literally old thinking. This is their old thinking. This is a plot of the frequency probability of X amount of warming from about 8 authors from the early part of the 21st century, the early years of the 21st century. And the black line at the top of the horizontal lines is the frequency distribution used by the Intergovernmental Interagency Working Group for the social cost of carbon. And the point of this is on the right, what you see are fat tails. And so that's why people invoke the precautionary principle on this issue, et cetera. Now, yes, I wish I did. Do I have a pointer? I can't, no. And you want me here because you're recording, right?
Yeah.
Yes?
Oh, whatever you want.
There should be a pointer on that.
Yeah, well, I'm wasting the few minutes allocated to me. This here is the fat tail here, and this is the probability distribution for warming used by the Interagency Working Group. In my upcoming book, Global Lukewarming, one of the chapters is called People Fear Their Fat Tails. Now, we have already seen this. The problem is we have a busted forecast. You cannot look at this graphic, which is the red line are the 5-year running means for lower tropospheric temperature for the 102 United Nations models that give a lower tropospheric temperature. The UN has 108 models, but 6 of them don't give a lower tropospheric temperature that can be used. And the colored, the green and blue dots are respectively the 2 simulations, or the 2 summaries of the satellite data, lower tropospheric satellite data, one by Spencer and Christie, the other one by Remote Sensing Systems out in California. And the other ones, the other dots, are the lower atmospheric temperature as measured by weather balloons, which are calibrated instruments that go up twice a day. There are 4 summaries of these, and these figures are the average. You cannot look at this picture and not realize that a tragedy is occurring by my profession's inability to admit the 3 most important, to say the 3 most important words in life, which is not I love you. It's we were wrong. I was wrong. And this is not just going to take down climate science. This illustration is going to take down people's faith in science. It cannot go on much longer. And the longer we wait, the worse it's going to be. Now, here's the satellite record. Senator Inhofe, I realize you're not here, but it's not 15 years. This is the new summary of the satellite record from the University of Alabama. On July 1st, that would be 6 days from today, we will begin our, I'm looking at the camera, 22nd year without a significant warming trend. That's correct. And the other analysis of the satellite data from Fritz Wentz et al., there it is, Remote Sensing Systems, begins its period without warming in November of 1994. The records are very, very similar now, 22 years without it. So here are the recent estimates of sensitivity beginning First papers on this, with one exception, which I will note in a minute, started to come out in 2011. And you can see these are the 95% confidence limits for the sensitivity given by Lewis and Curry in 2014, Skye et al. 2014, Spencer and Braswell 2013. The top arrow is what's used by the interagency working group. You can see why I said it's old thinking. And by the way, there was one paper published in 2002 that showed the same thing, but in the words of Andrew Revkin in an article about a year and a half ago, he said, it was an article on climate sensitivity, and it said scientists are reluctant to admit that the sensitivity may have been overestimated because a paper was published 10 years ago by a scientist normally associated with libertarian think tanks. You've made it in this world when you have no name. Anyway, and I don't want to talk about the implications of that. So, here is from Nick Lewis, very recently, using the latest estimates of sulfate cooling. That's the knob on the computer model that allows you to make it simulate the past wonderfully if you don't know what the sulfate load was, which we didn't until this paper came out by Stevens in 2015. And this is the probability distribution for the sensitivity after a doubling of carbon dioxide. Take a look. There are four different calculations that are made, and the mean value is somewhere around 1.2 degrees Celsius. My God, the Environmental Protection Agency uses 3 degrees Celsius as a matter of routine. Then there's also a measure called the transient climate sensitivity, which is the amount it should warm by the time that carbon dioxide doubles in the atmosphere, effectively doubles. It should probably be somewhere around 2065. And that is this one here. This is the total warming caused by greenhouse gases plus everything else around 2065. So it's about 1.1, maybe closer to 1 degree Celsius. Let's see. We've had 0.7 of a degree, let's call it 0.8 of a degree Celsius. Let's say half of that was due to human activity, just for the heck of it. So that means 0.4. That means you're going to get 0.6 of a degree over the next 5 decades. That's nothing compared to what has been forecast. The diversion, the disparity between the orange line in the killer slide and the lower tropospheric temperatures as measured by satellites and weather balloons will grow and grow and grow and grow until this profession that I am not happily a member of says we were wrong. Now, this was presented over to the American Geophysical Union in December, and it's a little complicated. I'm going to stand over there and ruin the video presentation. The solid dotted lines are the average of all 107 of the United Nations computer models. The average warming trend predicted for the last 10 years, the last 11 years, the last 12 years, 20, on out to the last 62 years, so beginning in 1951. So this would be 2004 through 2013, this would be 2003 through 2013, etc. And the models have the volcanoes in them, so that's the peak there where Pinatubo throws a cooling into the thing. The thin lines are the 95 and 97.5% confidence limits around the mean value predicted by the 107 models. And seeing as the model output is pretty normally distributed between models, you can apply standard statistics to it. The colored dots are the observed temperature changes for the last 10 years, for the last 11 years, and out to the last 62 years. Where the colored dots are green, the predicted changes fall within the 95% confidence level made of the model distribution of warming. Where the dots turn yellow, about 37 years ago, they fall out of the 95% confidence limit, and where the dots turn red, they fall out of the 97.5% confidence limit. If this were normal science, this, along with the plot of the model versus observed lower tropospheric temperature would provoke those three words, and those three words are, we were wrong. But we calculate the climate sensitivity based upon old thinking. And now Kevin is going to tell us how bad that part is.
Okay, so thank you, Pat. Thank you, David and Marlo, for being here. So my name is Kevin Dayaratna. I'm the Senior Statistician Research Programmer here at Heritage, and I'm going to talk about the social cost of carbon, which is the primary justification for this type of policy. So there are first important questions to ask. Firstly, how does the government estimate the social cost of carbon? And secondly, is it even a reliable tool for energy policymaking? And here's a picture of a roulette wheel, and I'd like you guys to keep it in mind as the talk goes on. So the social cost of carbon, firstly, what is it? It is defined by the EPA as the economic damages per metric ton of carbon dioxide emissions. So the general question is, how do we actually estimate this SEC? And the general question is, what is the long-term economic impact of carbon dioxide emissions summed across a particular time horizon? And there are three primary statistical models used by the Interagency Working Group to answer this question, namely the DICE model, the FUN model, and the PAGE model. And these models are estimated by what we call Monte Carlo simulation, where various aspects of these models are random, and they are therefore repeatedly estimated over a sequence of iterations. And as a result, various distributional properties of the social cost of carbon are generated. So the thing is, as with any statistical model, these models are grounded by assumptions, namely a discount rate, a time horizon, and the specification of what we call, and Pat alluded to this earlier, an equilibrium climate sensitivity distribution, and I'm going to get to that in a bit. So at Heritage, David Kreutzer and I ran two of these three models, and we rigorously examined these assumptions. Firstly, a discount rate. So we talked about summing damages. Now the thing is, not all damages are created equal. In particular, some people prefer benefits sooner rather than later, and costs later rather than sooner. So it's necessary to quantify this inequality. The EPA used discount rates to do so, and they used 2.5%, 3%, and 5% discount rates to do so, despite the fact that the Office of Management and Budget suggested that a 7% discount rate be used. In our research, we addressed this question by rerunning these models using the 7% discount rate as recommended by the OMB. Secondly, there's the assumption about a time horizon. Now, projected economic damages are summed, as I was alluding to earlier, in estimating the social cost of carbon. But the question is, for how long? Now, how far into the future can we see? So here's a picture of John Adams. Has anyone seen the HBO miniseries or read the book? So, long ago, John Adams predicted that America would one day become the greatest empire in the world. And he was right. But despite that fact, he and our other founding fathers would have almost surely had no idea what the American economy would have looked like today. Similarly, we have no idea what the American economy will look like 300 years from now. Yet these models precisely try to make projections that far into the future. At Heritage, we made the less unrealistic assumption of trying to project, say, 150 years into the future. And we re-estimated the models accordingly. Now, lastly, these models make the specification of, and Pat alluded to this earlier, an equilibrium climate sensitivity distribution. Now, global warming alarmists will consistently tell you, ooh, the science is settled on global warming. But the thing is, if it's science, then how can it be settled? New studies consistently come to light, replacing existing studies. The concept of equilibrium climate sensitivity distributions, or ECS distributions, is no different. The ECS distribution used by the IWG in estimating the SEC was suggested by Gerard Rowe and Marcia Baker and was published in the journal Science 8 years ago. Since then, a variety of newer ECS distributions have been published, including by Alexander Otto and his colleagues in the journal Nature, as well as Nick Lewis in the Journal of Climate, as well as many others. Now, if you look at this table, for example, and you compare the outdated Rowe-Baker distribution to the more up-to-date distributions, you can see some dramatic differences. The first column concerns a probability that the Earth's temperature will exceed a particular amount, and the subsequent columns depict the actual probability according to the particular ECS distribution. Now, if you look at the Earth probability increasing by more than 3.5 degrees Celsius, for example, you'll notice a probability of slightly over a third under the Rowe-Baker distribution, compared to drastically lower probabilities under the more up-to-date distribution specified by Alexander Otto and his colleagues, as well as Nick Lewis. In fact, under the Lewis distribution, that probability is slightly under 1 in 1,000. And you'll notice this for the other temperatures as well. It's not just true for the probability of the temperature exceeding 3.5 degrees Celsius. So let's take a step back and think about what this tells us. Well, essentially, this tells us that the IWG's assumptions vastly overstated the probabilities of extreme global warming in their computations of the social cost of carbon. So now what happens if we tweak these assumptions? In particular, what if we tweak the discount rate, the time horizon, or the ECS distribution? Well, let's take a look what happens. And I'd like to thank my intern, Kirby Lawrence, for putting these charts together. Here we can see that the SEC estimated a variety of discount rates and ECS distributions. For example, if we increase the discount rate under both the DICE and FUN models, we see drastically lower estimates of the SEC, from going to as high as $56 or so under the DICE model to as low as around $4 or $5. And even potentially going negative in the FUN model. And we're going to get to that in a second. And you'll notice that under the more up-to-date ECS distributions, the SEC estimates are also dramatically lower. For example, even if you stick to the low 2.5% discount rate that the IWG actually used, the SEC drops by over $20. And again, this shouldn't surprise you because the Rowe-Baker distribution used by the IWG vastly overstated the probability of extreme global warming compared to the more recent ECS distributions. Now, you notice some negativity in these slides, particularly under 7% and even under some of the other distributions, SEC estimates, under the FUN model. So let's take a step back and think about that. Do these models necessarily suggest that global warming is a good thing or a bad thing? That is, do they always suggest that there are economic damages associated with carbon dioxide emissions? Well, this is an interesting aspect of the modeling, and with the FUN model, the answer is no, and it actually allows for a negative social cost of carbon. And in our research at Heritage, what we did was we actually computed the probability of a negative social cost of carbon. And you notice that in some cases, especially under higher discount rates, you notice drastically high estimates of the probability of the social of a negative SCC, even under their outdated Rowe-Baker distribution. And under the Otto et al. Distribution, the probabilities are well over 60% for, say, 2020. So what if we actually wanted to take these models seriously? Supposing they have legitimacy, which they don't. Well, if you do take them seriously and institute the proposed regulations, we found that using the Heritage Energy Model, our clone of the National Energy Modeling System used by the EIA, that by 2030, you'd have an average employment shortfall of over 300,000 lost jobs, a peak employment shortfall of over 1 million jobs, and over 500,000 lost manufacturing jobs. So the bottom line is the models can't be trusted. You saw earlier that the results of the SEC were literally all across the map. And if you do trust them and implement the associated regulations that the administration is suggesting, the results would literally be an economic disaster. So let's just think about this. Is there any reason to believe these models? They're extremely sensitive to the slightest tweaks to assumptions, with results literally scattered across the map, going from positive to negative, with, in some cases, high probabilities of negative social cost of carbon. It's very difficult to take them seriously. Moreover, the damage functions used to estimate the social cost of carbons are arbitrary. So going back to our picture of the roulette wheel, essentially taking the social cost of carbon seriously for environmental rulemaking is tantamount to going to Vegas, spinning the roulette wheel, and using that as an estimate of the SEC. So who here wants to spin the roulette wheel on the social cost of carbon? Thank you. And yeah, well, we're happy to take questions at the end.
Well, thank you, David and the Heritage Foundation, and it's really such a pleasure to be on a panel with all three of you are my mentors, I think, on this subject. And what I'll try to do is just maybe elaborate a few points that that they couldn't get to because of the short time span we have here. And I see that that screen is too tiny for me to see, so I'm going to grab my printout of this. And this first slide here that, actually that's not the slide I want to show you first. It's the one called Overview, which this is basically how I see the big picture of this whole discussion of the social cost of carbon. And I'll try to illustrate some of these points without duplicating too much of what has come before. But one big point I want to get across is that the social cost of carbon is an unknown quantity, and I would even contend an unknowable quantity because it's not discernible in the data of the real world. It's not discernible in meteorological data nor in economic data. So where does it come from? Well, we've just heard it comes from computer models which combine a speculative climatology with a speculative economics. And by fiddling with the inputs of these models, which as we've heard include discount rates, climate sensitivity assumptions, but also beyond that, how global warming rates would affect weather patterns and how weather patterns would affect climate sensitive areas of the economy like agriculture and forestry, and then in turn how that would affect employment and consumption and human health. So it is a multi-layered set of assumptions in which the uncertainties then propagate through each layer. And so this means that the social cost of carbon analysts can get just about any result they desire by fiddling with the knobs, by tweaking the inputs. Well, what is it that they desire? Well, they desire to get the biggest possible social cost of carbon number that they can. And why is that? Well, because the bigger the social cost of carbon, the easier it is to justify more costly anti-carbon regulations. Could be carbon taxes, cap and trade, Soviet-style production quota for renewable energy. The bigger the social cost of carbon, the more plausible it seems that all of that is good for us. And in fact, one of the things that they're really trying to do here is, and this is why I call the social cost of carbon computer-aided sophistry. And I'm using sophistry in the old Greek sense of sham wisdom raised to an art. Okay, now this is hyped up with a computer. It's to sell us on the proposition that fossil fuels are actually unaffordable no matter how cheap, and renewables are a bargain at any price. That's what they're really after. And that's why they can claim that all of these policies they're proposing will only make us better off, that all the wealth that we think is real, which we can trace to the fossil energy technologies that actually power our civilization, are illusory because we're not seeing the hidden costs which are revealed by this social cost of carbon analysis. Now, another big point that I want to make is that even if the social cost of carbon were an exact science, even if they got the science and economics exactly right, which they can't because this is all based on these highly speculative assumptions and arbitrary inputs like how high you set the discount rate. Even if they got it exactly right, it would still be biased, it would still be one-sided, it would still be a partisan agenda masquerading as science. Why is that? Because it is never combined with a rigorous assessment of the social benefits of carbon energy, and consequently never combined with an assessment of the social costs of carbon mitigation. And one point that I will try to get to by the end is that the social costs of carbon mitigation vastly outweigh the alleged social costs of carbon. Now, let me get to the first point, and I'm not going to go through all 50 of my slides. Don't worry, David. I just wanted to be loaded for bear because I didn't know how I would be able to fit into these wonderful presentations from my mentors here. So I decided to be like a Boy Scout and have as many arrows in my quiver as I could. But the first point that I made was that the social cost of carbon is an unknown quantity. And this is just one example of dozens that I've got in my slideshow, which I guess will be posted by Heritage, and so you can all look at all of them. But here we see the frequency of landfalling hurricanes in the United States since 1900. There's either no trend in that data or it's slightly declining. This comes from Roger Pilkey Jr. Same thing with the power or strength of U.S. hurricanes, landfalling hurricanes since 1900 as measured by the Power Dissipation Index. No trend or a slight downward trend. Now, you might think, well, but hurricane-related losses, economic damages are increasing. Yes, but that's because there's more stuff and more people in harm's way. When you normalize the loss data, that's a technical term that means you adjust it, for changes in population, wealth, and the consumer price index, then once again, you see no trend. So I defy any of these social cost of carbon modelers to find the greenhouse fingerprint, the actual social cost of carbon in this very important data. The same thing is true worldwide. This is from a study by Winkle et al. In 2012. No trend in the strength and frequency of landfalling hurricanes globally since 1950 or 1970, depending on how far back the data set goes in which hurricane basin. No trend in accumulated cyclone energy globally since the 1970s. You see profound interdecadal variability. And then once again, what we see, this is now all forms of extreme weather, normalized damages. And you see no trend going back to 1960. If you look at something like floods, which was mentioned earlier before in the United States, no trend since 1950. That's a U.S. Geological Survey study. The Palmer Drought Severity Index for the United States going back to 1895. You don't see an increase in drought in the United States overall. What you see, rather, is a slight increase in wetness. And thank you, Pat, for that wonderful slide. Many of these slides I've taken. This is what the IPCC latest report said about droughts and floods globally. And basically, since the mid-20th century, which is about as far back as global data goes on droughts and floods, there is no confidence in any kind of trend. So once again, you cannot find the social cost of carbon or evidence of a social cost of carbon in economic data or meteorological data. What we do find is that just since 1982, there's been an 11% increase in green foliage in arid areas in all continents of the world. That looks like a social benefit of carbon dioxide to me. Here's a study that Brother Pat over here was instrumental in producing, and it just shows that decade by decade in the United States, as urban air temperatures have gotten hotter, heat-related mortality has gone down. Where's the social cost of carbon there? This is another set that Pat has put together. But here's, I think, one of the really important slides here, which is historically the most lethal form of extreme weather was drought because it limits access to food and water. And in the 1920s, 472,000 people, that's an estimate, died from drought conditions, okay? And since then, what has happened? Well, about 90% of all the industrial carbon dioxide emissions ever released into the air since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution occurred, okay? And we had maybe 0.8 C of warming since that time. Fossil fuel consumption went through the roof globally, and we had a 99.98% decrease in deaths related to drought, even though you had about a tripling of the global population. And if you're looking at death rates, it's a 99.99% decrease. Find the social cost of carbon in that that's really essential. We're talking about life and death here on a very large scale. And you can find the same thing with extreme weather generally. You can look at malaria. Malaria has been, even though, yes, there's a relationship between malaria and warm weather. You give mosquitoes more months of hot weather and you'll get more mosquitoes. But wealth and technology has trumped climate here dramatically. This little graph here shows the difference between 2007 and 1900. And the latest report by the World Health Organization on malaria shows a dramatic decline in malaria incidence and deaths in Africa just since the year 2000, even though there was a 43% increase in the population in Africa living in those historic malaria transmission areas. So someone please find the social cost of carbon there. You can also see that just shows that all these major food crops since 1960, the yields have increased by a minimum of 100%. In some cases, it's way more. So we're not seeing global warming taking a huge toll on global food production. Quite the contrary. There we go. This is from a study done by our friend Craig Idzo, who calculated that the CO2 fertilization effect just since 1961 has added about $3.2 trillion to global agriculture. That's a huge increase in making food more affordable, in food security. So this is a carbon benefit. And he projects, based on this largely experimental data, that it will see another $9.6 trillion in additional agricultural output between now and 2050, thanks to the carbon dioxide fertilization effect. And so then, if you look at the bigger picture, the biggest picture of all, which is civilization, since the year one, you'll see an amazing hockey stick here. You'll see carbon dioxide concentration zooming up at the end. You'll also see per capita income zooming up and population zooming up. I know that some people some people of the greener persuasion have a problem with population, but to me it just means sheer abundance of human life, and it is obviously an indicator of health. I mean, you wouldn't have billions more people if people were getting sicker and dying. And also per capita income zooming up. I just want to mention, well, I guess I went through this already. There's a whole train of assumptions that they play with in order to get these. I'm out? Pretty close to out. Okay. Well, let me just then jump to the very end, but anyway, as I said, you folks can read the rest of the story online if you're interested, if I have tweaked your interest at all. I mentioned that they overlook entirely the social and economic benefits of carbon energy and hence the costs of carbon mitigation, the social costs. And this set of slides just shows that even without the whole suite of climate policies that they would like to ram down the collective throat of the American economy, that energy costs have been rising over the last 20 years. And especially for people in lower income brackets, that is to say, as a proportion of their income. And then you could see also in the second graph that low-income households that have to cope with higher energy costs actually have to make real sacrifices in terms of medical care, paying the rent, food. So these costs are not just hypothetical, and I'll end with this. This is the grand program of the Obama administration, the whole green movement, the whole UN bureaucratic complex. This is the climate treaty that's being negotiated, and the goal of this thing is to reduce global CO2 emissions 60% below 2010 levels by 2050. This is a wonderful little slide put together by our friend Steve Yulee at the Chamber of Commerce, and he shows that this really then requires about a 75% reduction in global emissions from the baseline in 2050. And he asked the simple question, well, who is going to make those cuts and how much? So here's how the simple arithmetic breaks down. If the industrialized countries, which is us, magically go cold turkey and reduce our emissions to zero by 2050, the developing countries still have to cut their CO2 emissions 35% in order to meet this UN target. Now, am I saying 35% below their baseline in 2050? No, 35% below their current emissions. And we're talking about a part of the world where about 1.2 billion people have no access to electricity whatsoever. Another 2.3 billion or so have only unreliable access to electricity, not enough to make their countries an attractive place to invest money. So it is a huge hindrance, one of the major obstacles to their growth. Now let's get back to this. What if, more realistically or less unrealistically, we can only cut our emissions 80% by 2050? Well, then those very poor developing countries that lack modern commercial energy, 87% of which comes from fossil sources, they have to cut their emissions from today's levels pretty much in half. And so that is a humanitarian disaster in the making. There is a huge social and economic cost in such a disaster. And that is the kind of trajectory that they are trying to justify based on this pseudoscience of social cost of carbon estimation. Thank you.
Well, thank the panelists very, very much. We do have, we'll take some time for questions, whether we have it or not, we're taking it. And we have, again, the microphones, because this is being taped by C-SPAN and, of course, for the Heritage Online archive. So if you have a question, raise your hand, wait for the microphone, say who you are, and if you have an affiliation with an organization, say that. Okay, down here, do we have a microphone on this side? Thank you.
Am I on?
Yes.
Hi, my question is for Kevin. My name is Sophie Miller. I work with the GW Regulatory Studies Center. I really appreciated your sensitivity analysis. I thought that was really interesting. I'm curious, this is a two-part question. One, I'm curious if your estimates were more sensitive to discount rate or more sensitive to ECS. And two, I'm curious if you can tell me a little bit about why you chose OMB's 7%, because if memory serves, in Circular A4, I think that was intended for public investments like infrastructure. And I know that, of course, just because OMB says use a number, that doesn't mean it's the right one, but I'm wondering if you could walk me through why you wanted to test that number specifically.
Okay. So the first part of your question was comparing ECS distributions to the discount rates. I think actually, if you look at our DICE model paper, we handed it out outside. We actually computed percent differences, and I think we saw greater sensitivity to the use of the ECS distributions actually. So your second question, why did we decide to use a 7% discount rate? Actually, if you read the Circular A4 carefully, it actually suggests that for this type of analysis, the 7% discount rate is appropriate. And we just wanted to do this primarily just to test the sensitivity to these assumptions. And as you saw, these results are just literally scattered all across the map.
If I could.
I'll just jump in. The Circular A4 says 3 and 7, and in some extreme cases, you can use something outside that. But under no circumstances they say you shouldn't use 7 that I could find.
Let me quote from it if I could. Quote.
I think Pat has
I have it right
text
here.
right here.
Quote. A real discount rate of 7% should be used as a base case for regulatory analysis. Words have meaning.
But yeah, that is critical. Down here?
Kevin, I guess, and our Pat.
He happens to be Randy Randall.
Yes. Aide de camp to whoever. Do you know why the fund model by Richard Toll gives us a negative cost called benefits? Do you have any reason at all? What in the damage function gives you that result?
Oh, thank you for the question, Randy. Well, the thing is, and I suggested this toward the end of the talk, the damage functions themselves are determined a priori by the researcher. The fund model allows for negativity because there's certain potential benefits of CO2 emissions, such as fertilization, for example. And it's just the way that the damage function is structured. I think any of these models can actually be tweaked to allow for negativity in terms of the damage function.
May I follow up with that? Yeah. The fund model is the only model of the three that has a CO2 fertilization benefit. And the CO2 fertilization benefit is so well established in empirical science that the other two models should be rejected out of hand as inherently biased. I mean, they do not pass muster under the Data Quality Act. I will say this about the fund model. One reason why the social cost of carbon estimate jumped 60% in only 4 years, why climate change somehow got 60% worse, even though the global warming plateau lasted for another 4 years, and the divergence increased by that much more. The reason is that the fund model was updated in such a way that the same climate sensitivity generated a more rapid warming. And so they said that meant that the higher temperatures and the associated damages are reached earlier and are therefore discounted less. So the fund model, even though it's better than the others, somehow contributed to that increase in the social cost of carbon between 2010 and 2013. And that explanation seems to me just preposterous, because what we've seen over the last 18 and a half years, or as Pat was saying, 22 years, is quite the reverse of an acceleration. There's no evidence that climate change, that global warming is accelerating, and yet that assumption comes out of the fund model into the interagency working group's calculation. Go figure.
Time for another one? Well, thank you all for sticking with us for the extra 15 minutes. Appreciate it very much. Can you give an applause to our panelists?